Welcome to Essential C.S. Lewis on YouTube, a feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty. How much do you know about the Inklings? Well, they were a group of writers and friends that included Lewis, among others. Today, I'm looking at not just Lewis, but also other Inklings and also some adjacent figures because of a new book in 2026 by G. Connor Salter that is entitled The Other Inklings. Welcome back to the show, Connor.
Thank you.
Well, now, starting at the beginning, how the other Inklings came to be is something that the listener will get a more full understanding when they read your introduction. However, covering at least part of the story is necessary to frame that discussion. So let's address what this book is and is not.
Well, what it is a collection of interviews by people who have studied the Inklings or occasionally people who are related to the Inklings or adjacent figures, giving a sense of how scholarship on the group has evolved, especially over the last 30 years in the American Christian setting, but also looking at planets and crannies that have not always been explored in the research. So that makes it a combination of oral history and primary source scholarship.
Well, now, your book is divided into six parts, so let's proceed with exploring the first, which has a common theme of discussing multiple inklings. Given that there are 11 authors in this section and more questions yet to come, we can't go into much depth. So either give concise summaries of each or go deeper with just, say, four of them.
All right. Well, I was looking at people who their discussions brought up multiple inklings together in ways that didn't kind of fit easily into the structure. So, Catherine Madsen was discussing her work as one of the early Tolkien fans in the 60s when it was became a big campus novel, but she also talked quite a lot about Charles Williams. So you can sort of see the combination there. And then you had Michael Christensen, who was looking at primarily at Lewis, but also at other members of the Inklings, and a little bit at his work as an Henri Nouwen scholar. So that was there were also, of course, looks at people like Douglas Anderson, who was one of the first wave of Tolkien scholars. He worked with Humphrey Carpenter on the book The Inklings. He was talking about a range of people he's worked on, mostly Tolkien, but also at Lewis and at William Lindsay Gresham, who's Joy Davidman's first husband. So that gives you really a very good sense in that section of how Inkling scholarship across the board has developed.
Okay, well, now we might say that my favorite section is part two, which focuses on Lewis. You interviewed seven authors, including one famous one with the initials W&O. That's me, of course, but we can let the listeners get your book to learn more about what I talk about there. But what can you tell us about the other six?
Well, we had Diana Glyer speaking about her work on the Inklings as an artistic community. And some of you may know, of course, her book Bandersnatch and the more detailed version, the name of which escapes me at the moment, which
The
go a really
company they
deep look
keep.
into the company they keep. I kept wanting to say the Fellowship, and I thought, no, that's a different book. The company they keep, yes. That's, of course, one of her major works of scholarship. She's also done a lot of work on Warney Lewis, the older brother, and his friendship with a missionary at the end of his life. That was a big part of the discussion as well. And then there were each scholarship has a specialty. So your work was looking a lot at Lewis and the Screwtape letters, and I included some discussions we've had about Inklings and disability studies. But then also people like Anne Michel Frédéric Caballero, who's a French scholar who's done a lot of work on Lewis and his time in France during World War One, or more broadly at just the more continental European side of Inkling scholarship. And then we had people like Sarah Waters talking about how her work on Lewis intersected with her work on Shakespeare. And then there was also, let me see, oh yes, Crystal Hurd speaking about her time as initially on Lewis, but then looking at his father, Albert.
Okay. Well, now then, in the next section, you interviewed only four individuals for part three on Charles Williams. But before telling us about them, provide a quick summary of, I don't know, you might say the pros and cons of Williams, who engaged in practices many would find unusual. Now, we could spend in a whole program or a series of programs even about that, but so just give us a thumbnail sketch and then tell us a few elements about the interviews with those four individuals.
All right, so to summarize then, Williams was a practicing Anglo-Catholic and he wrote theology books, but like quite a lot of people of his generation, he was also involved in a couple of secret societies. These were pretty common throughout the 19th century because there had been a backlash against the Industrial Revolution, which had made everything feel very mundane, very materialistic. So you had these movements in Europe to try and recapture a supernatural sense of the world. Often people who were looking around for obscure bits of mystical practices that were trying to give you a direct spiritual experience with God. And they would often mishmash three or four different religious traditions and market it as the secret Christian tradition that the church is trying to hide. That there are a whole range of reasons why they said that often it's a combination of sloppy scholarship or people trying to recover a sense of what they thought the church used to be and not having the education to quite fully realize how they're secretizing Christianity with several different other traditions. And what you get out of that are people who have this often very vivid sense of closeness to God, but their practices that they think are Christian can be a little bit curious. In Williams's case, he has this deep sense of what it means to be part of the church, and that the church is people who all participate in the body of Christ and are connected together in deep and very concrete ways. And he thinks that that means that though we can bear each other's burdens, is very he has a very radical sense of that. Like he seems to think that I could take on your cold for a job interview for a day, which and there is a tradition in the church, especially in the Desert Fathers, that believes in that. But the way Williams takes it gets a little bit complicated because the way he discusses some of these ideas feels a little bit more like saying a magic spell to get a guaranteed result than it feels like submitting to God and then God in His grace letting you do something unusual. So that's the point where it gets messy with Williams. Is his thinking is a little more magical than he realizes, and because his primary spiritual education is in these kind of groups where you have a student and a master, and you have a secret program you're learning, and everything is handled in a very reverent way. That meant that the way Williams treated women who sought his spiritual advice got controlling and creepy, and it's not quite clear that he realized that he was developing these odd sort of sadistic, masochistic, I control you, you obey me kind of interactions until near the end of his life when he begins to realize, oh, I caused pain without meaning to. And sadly, he doesn't live long enough to really deal with the consequences and reconcile with people. So all of that has created a lot of complicated questions about was he abusive without meaning to? Was he as Christian as he meant to be? Or did he syncretize Christianity with other things he shouldn't have? It creates a lot of problems and have become much more openly discussed the last 10 years or so because we didn't have a really detailed biography on him until 2015. So, in that context, what I was getting into with authors like David Loondods and Serena Higgins, and to some extent with Sarah Thompson, and a little bit also with Stephen Hayes, is saying, okay, how do we feel about him as a Christian teacher? And how do we a lot of it ends up being very good material now because the church too movement brought up a lot of questions about what do I do when my spiritual mentor is more complicated than I want to admit, more selfish than they realized, and how do I even deal with we're having the wide spectrum of people who grew up Christian but are trying to supplement that with other traditions and not realizing that creates problems. In that context, looking at Williams's foibles as well as his strengths turned out to be very, very fruitful.
Okay, very interesting. Well, now, in the next section, you deal with Owen Barfield, who might be for some even less known to the casual Lewis reader. Some of his beliefs also Christians would find a little bit unusual, but nevertheless, we aren't going to be diving deep into that. We could devote several interviews to that aspect alone here, but that's not our purpose here. But provide a few highlights about him for a context, and then share about some elements of those two interviews that you did.
All right. So Owen Barfield was one of Lewis's university friends, and work he was researching into how language changes and what that tells you about how our worldview changes over time. That had some big consequences for the way Lewis talked about human history because it becomes very hard to be a kind of classic dismissive atheist treating religion as medieval and therefore backward if you have to say, oh, wait, the way language is changing tells me that there's not a human beings aren't evolving in a linear kind of way. And we have different phases where the way we talk about the supernatural is getting better or getting worse, which means I can't be a dismissive about the fact that I'm modern and therefore everything before me is inherently backward. That pushed him to rethink the way he felt about theism, which leads to him becoming a believer in God. And then through that, the work he does with Tolkien helps him to become a Christian. So Barfoot provides a very important subtext to how Lewis becomes a Christian in the first place. And because he's regularly visiting Inklings meetings in Oxford, and he has a lifelong friendship with Tolkien and with Lewis, and has some interactions with Williams and other Inklings. He becomes a foundational member of the group, even though he's not at the pub meetings at the Eagle and Child or the reading feedback sessions at Lewis's Oxford rooms every single week. He has this very strong influence on the group, even though their huge section where he's off working as a lawyer in London. And in particular, what I got into when I was talking with his grandson, Owen A. Barfield, and also with the scholar Landon Lofton, is how does he interact with Inklings and influence their work as a philosopher who's interested in the way language develops and what that tells us about the mind, but also about consciousness. He's very interested in how does the way I perceive the world and what does that tell me about my spiritual worldview and even what the soul is, what the mind is, what the brain is, which is a lot of the building blocks you get into if you get really deep into Tolkien and Lewis's talk about what is myth good for, what is the Christian worldview give us that other worldviews don't. If you dive deep into that as a philosopher, you eventually run into very Barfieldian ideas if you go deep enough into it.
Ah, very fascinating. I'm sure people will look forward to learning more if that's a person they want to learn more about. Something also that people that are familiar with Lewis should have heard a name of, and that is George MacDonald. And of course, while he obviously was not an Inkling, he was a major influence on Lewis, among others. What are some of the most interesting elements from your four interviews in this part?
Well, I talked to a number of different authors who've done deep work. I talked to Trevor Hart, who's done a lot of theological writing over the years. He was looking at a number of specific questions about MacDonald as a Scottish theologian of that time. The talk with Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson was also especially interesting because one of Kirsten's big discussions is we know that MacDonald was a pastor for years, and we know that then he stops being a pastor full time anyway. Why did that happen? And what exactly were the concerns his denomination, well, no, his congregation raised? And her point was, well, there were a lot of stories you hear, but what you really get when you look at the research is that his congregation had a really rough time with pastors for several years. And some of the ways that the fact that MacDonald was not giving a classic, stern Scottish Presbyterian discussion about what it means to be have free will or to be preordained for salvation. The fact that he was much more okay with God and his love working with you as you come toward him, and that he wasn't a stern fire and brimstone Presbyterian Calvinist, that became a big issue for the church because at that time just Calvinism was, and very blunt, upfront kind of take on it was in vogue.
Okay. Yeah. Just, I guess as a side note, it sounds like you're saying that the congregation was just picky overall. And so I don't know how often they change pastors per se, but it sounds like they, did maybe something like that. So it's not like George MacDonald was some unusual in his preaching, except for that in the context and then the church where he was at.
Yeah, that would be fair. He's often described as a universalist. I'm not sure that's the quite correct term. What he has is a strong sense that God in his mercy will leave you room to find him, but you're going to have to work out your issues. So he has a much more gentler view than the standard Calvinist. I'm preordained, or I'm not, or I'm damned perspective. And the church he'd been at had gotten rid of at least one pastor in the past, and was not very open to that welcoming view of salvation. So there was a situation where they essentially tried to force him out by cutting his salary down to nothing. And he managed somehow to stick around for about a year on a minimal salary. And then he and his wife had about 10 kids across the course of their lifetime. So you just can't, sadly, not kids who live to be adults in many cases, but still, that's a lot of kids and a lot of money you have to make. So at the end of that year, it became clear he just couldn't afford to do it. So he had to leave the church, and then he becomes a preacher at large in many different places, often in very high demand. And then he also writes lots and lots of novels, and he does some groundbreaking Shakespeare scholarship. But the work he is doing as a theologian and as a pastor kind of continues in his life no matter where he's at.
Okay. Well, then now your final part is individual that is not often looked at because he is a very adjacent person within Lewis studies, and so this is the ex-husband of Lewis's wife, and that is William Lindsay Gresham. You interviewed actually 10 people for this, so it's obviously not possible to go into a lot of depth with it. But what's a taste of what people will find there?
Well, there hasn't been a full-fledged book on Gresham yet. I knew someone who was working on one that person was interviewed in the book. And I also got to meet people who had done most of the foundational work on him, people like Alan Wald, who has done deep work on Gresham and Joy Davidman in the 30s and early 40s when they were part of the New York American left, and where they fed into that whole discussion about the blacklisting and the Red Scare and how what we would think of as left wing ideas inform the way that they talk about community in their novels. But I was also looking at people like Gresham's stepchildren, Rosemary and Bob, who he was essentially he was essentially their father figure for most of their lives. And so I was trying to get a sense from their perspective on what was he like as a dad, what was he like after he got sober, because the story you get, especially in most Inklings books, is about him when his marriage is going downhill, and also when he and Joy were dabbling into something that was pitched as a power of positive thinking therapy called Dianetics. And it went on to have a very creepy reputation as it developed into a much more controlling group. But during the period when they were very into it for about 4 years, they were kind of trying to teach themselves Dianetics, and that was having a lot of messy effects on their emotional and mental health, which helps to explain why he comes across as a very volatile individual in Shadowlands and in other movies about the Inklings. There's a lot of, sadly, neither of them were in very good shape during that period. So up to a point, what I was looking at in the 10 interviews was, okay, Shadowlands gives you a scent of one side of this story, but there's a whole other side that isn't looked into. So what do we get from the other side of the story? And also trying to give you an overview of obscure little places where he's seen as important to other fields of study. Like for Golden Age sci-fi fans, he's interesting because he appears to be friends with Robert Heinlein for a period. If you're into crime fiction, his book Nightmare Alley is a big deal. And some of that ends up because Nightmare Alley is a book about a carnival entertainer who passes himself off as a vaudeville mentalist and then as a con artist pretending that he has genuine psychic powers. You get into a lot of ideas there that are pretty similar to concerns Lewis and Tolkien raise in their works about yes, there's an innate need for the supernatural. Yes, there is a need to talk about what that means for us. But if you start pretending that you have magic powers that you don't, you leap the whirlwind. Nightmare Alley deals with that, only it deals with it more in the context of stage magic, and when stage magic tends to be ritual magic, as opposed to mythic fantasy, where you're dealing with that with a character like Saruman, who's doing all of these tricks to mess with your head in his fictitious setting. It's a lot of ideas the Inklings explore in a much more dark, existential way in a very different context.
Okay. Well, now your book actually doesn't end there. You have no less than 8 appendices, three of which deal with Gresham. Touch on them some here and expand on why they are in that part of your book, along with a preview of some of the other segments and the other appendices.
All right. Well, some of the appendices were things that had come up in the earlier work that just didn't fit terribly well. Like Joyce McPherson had done an excellent summary about the best books to learn about MacDonald, but that didn't fit terribly well in her interviews. It worked well at the back. But also, because I knew that someone else was working on Gresham and there had already been a book on David Min, there were a lot of small things that I was looking into in my own research, like Gresham as a counterculture Greenwich Village poet, or Gresham and his time with Dianetics, or how people in the stage magic San Francisco scene have perceived Nightmare Alley in healthy and unhealthy ways, or what we know about. There'd been a story about him being under surveillance by the FBI, and no one had really established if he really was. So all of these little nooks and crannies that a conventional biographer would discuss eventually, but that wasn't a biography yet, and they didn't really fit in the interviews anywhere, so they made much more sense to put them at the back of the book. The other elements were things like there was a discussion about my time hunting down whether there really was an FBI surveillance document showing that they were keeping tabs on Gresham and David Min and also one of Gresham's girlfriends in the 40s and 50s. I finally was able to find that, and there's a section looking at there was a story about whether Gresham had a piece of his work adapted for the Twilight Zone, and then I had to do some deep look into all those studies. The answer was no. It looks like one of his stories was optioned for the Twilight Zone, but to get a sense of why that was and why it might not have been made into an episode, you have to look into all these questions about what kind of people were optioned for Twilight Zone episodes in the 60s and why the whole bigger story of people like Ray Bradbury and Rod Sterling and how the golden age of sci-fi was adapted and translated into that series.
Oh, okay, very good. Yeah. All right. Well, again, we've been talking about Connor's book, the Other Inklings, and so where can people find you online to keep up with what you're doing?
Well, you can find me on my website, gcsalterwordpress.com. I'm reasonably active on Facebook. I do quite a lot of work through a magazine called Fellowship and Fairy Dust. Many of my articles appear on there. And yeah, if you look up something like Serena Higgins' blog, The Oddest Inkling, I'm often mentioned there because a lot of my Williams scholarship ends up getting mentioned there as it comes out.
Okay, great. And we'll provide links to that in the description. Well, Connor, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thanks for watching Essential C.S. Lewis on YouTube, a feature of EssentialCSLewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty. I also have a YouTube channel called Adult Autism with William, where I share about only learning I was autistic at the age of 60, along with understanding level 1 autism from the perspective of an adult. The channel has also interviews with other autistic adults. At EssentialCSLewis.com, you can find a variety of material, including various interviews with authors related to Lewis and sometimes live recordings. Please consider liking, sharing this video, and subscribing to this channel. Finally, please follow the link in the description to learn about my latest book, the Screwtape Letters Handbook. Also, there will be a link to my other book from 2018, The Misquotable C.S. Lewis. Thanks again for watching.